Jake Morrison woke up with his head pounding like a drum and dirt in his mouth. His eyes opened slowly and everything looked blurry. The last thing he remembered was his shuttle spinning out of control after something hit the engine. Now he was lying on cold stone with heavy metal chains around his wrists and ankles. He tried to sit up, but the chains pulled tight. The metal was thick and old-looking but very strong. Jake looked around and saw he was in some kind of cell made of dark stone blocks. Light came through a small window high up on the wall. The air smelled strange, like burning metal and something else he could not name. Jake was 28 years old and had been a marine engineer for 6 years before joining the colonial fleet. He knew how to stay calm when things went wrong. He took deep breaths and tried to remember his training. First thing was to check for injuries. His left shoulder hurt bad and his leg was cut, but nothing seemed broken. His uniform was torn and dirty, but still on his body. The cell door was made of thick wood with iron bars. Jake could hear voices outside speaking in a language he had never heard before. The sounds were high and musical, but also harsh at the same time. He pulled at the chains again, but they were attached to the wall with big iron rings. Hours passed, and Jake heard footsteps coming closer. The door opened with a loud creak and 3 figures walked in. Jake had never seen anything like them before. They were tall and thin with blue skin that looked almost like it glowed in the dim light. Each one had 4 arms and wore golden armor that covered their chest and legs. Their faces were long with big eyes that looked like silver coins. The one in the middle had more gold on his armor and a tall hat with strange symbols carved into it. He spoke in the musical language and pointed at Jake. The other 2 grabbed Jake's arms and pulled him to his feet. The chains were long enough to let him walk, but not run. They led Jake out of the cell and through stone corridors that seemed to go on forever. The walls had pictures carved into them showing creatures and symbols Jake did not understand. Some pictures showed humans being thrown into a deep pit with something large and scary at the bottom. Jake felt his stomach turn cold when he saw those pictures. They came to a big room with a high ceiling and more of the blue-skinned aliens standing around. In the center was a raised platform where the one with the fancy hat stood. He spoke in a loud voice and all the others listened. Jake could not understand the words, but the tone sounded like a judge giving a sentence. The alien leader pointed at Jake and said something that made the crowd make excited noises. Jake noticed that some of the aliens looked afraid while others looked hungry for something bad to happen. The leader had a staff with a red stone on top that seemed to glow with its own light. After the speech was over, 2 more aliens came forward. These ones wore different clothes and had tools hanging from their belts. They grabbed Jake and started painting symbols on his face and arms with red paint that felt warm against his skin. The paint had a metallic smell that made Jake think of blood. While they painted him, Jake tried to figure out what was happening. The aliens seemed to be preparing him for something important. The way they looked at him reminded him of how people looked at sacrificial animals in old movies. That thought made his heart beat faster. When the painting was done, they brought him different clothes. The new outfit was made of rough brown cloth and looked very old. They took away his torn uniform and boots and gave him leather sandals that were too big for his feet. The clothes felt strange against his skin and smelled like they had been worn by many people before him. The alien leader came down from the platform and walked around Jake like he was inspecting a piece of equipment. He spoke in his musical language and touched the red symbols on Jake's face. His 4 hands moved in patterns that seemed to have meaning. Other aliens nodded and made sounds that might have been agreement. Jake was led to another cell that was bigger than the first one. This time he was not alone. In the corner sat a woman with brown hair and torn clothes like his. She looked up when he came in and her eyes went wide with surprise. "You're human," she said in English, and Jake felt relief flood through him. "Jake Morrison," he said, "colonial engineer from the supply ship Meridian." "Lisa Carter," she replied, "xenobiologist from the same ship. I've been here for 3 weeks. Lisa moved closer and Jake could see she had the same red symbols painted on her face and arms. She looked thin and tired, but her eyes were sharp and alert. "What do they want with us?" Jake asked. "They think we're Demons from the sky, Lisa said in a quiet voice. They have a ritual where they feed people to something they call their dragon god. I've been learning their language and watching their customs. They do this every few months. Dragon god, Jake repeated. You mean like a real dragon? Something big and dangerous that lives in a pit under the city, Lisa said. I've heard it roar at night. The sound shakes the whole building. No one they've fed to it has ever come back. Jake felt his mouth go dry. He had fought in battles and survived dangerous missions, but this was different. This was something out of legends and nightmares. How many others are there? He asked. Just us now, Lisa said. They took the last 3 prisoners yesterday. I could hear the screaming from here. Jake looked around the cell and tried to think. The walls were solid stone and the door was thick, wood with iron bands. The chains were heavy but might have weak spots after years of use. He had to find a way out before they decided it was his turn to meet their dragon god. Tell me everything you know about these aliens, Jake said. Their weapons, their habits, anything that might help. Lisa nodded and began to speak in low tones. Outside the cell, Jake could hear the musical voices of their captors and the sound of drums beginning to beat somewhere in the distance. 3 days passed in the stone cell, and Jake learned everything he could from Lisa. The aliens called themselves Zephyrians, and their city was built around a massive pit that went deep into the ground. The pit was connected to underground caves where their dragon god lived among pools of hot lava. Every few months when the dragon got hungry, it would roar and the priests would know it was time for another sacrifice. Lisa had counted the days and knew that the ritual was coming soon. She could tell by the way the guards acted and the sounds of preparation coming from outside. The drums that had been beating softly for days were getting louder and more frequent. Jake could hear them even through the thick stone walls. On the 4th morning, the cell door opened and 6 guards came in. They were all armed with bronze spears and wore leather armor over their blue skin. The leader pointed at Jake and spoke. In the Zephyrian language, Lisa translated quickly. They say it's time for the sky demon to face judgment, she whispered as the guards grabbed Jake's arms. Jake looked back at Lisa as they dragged him away. Her face was pale, but she tried to smile. Remember what I told you about their weak spots, she said. And don't give up. The guards led Jake through corridors he had not seen before. These walls were covered in carvings that showed the history of the dragon rituals. Jake saw pictures of hundreds of people being lowered into the pit over many years. Some looked like they were from different alien races, while others looked human. None of the pictures showed anyone coming back out. They brought him to a large chamber where dozens of Zephyrians waited. In the center was a table covered with old weapons and pieces of armor. The weapons were made of bronze and looked very old. There were swords with dull blades, spears with cracked handles, and shields made of wood and metal that had seen better days. A priest with elaborate golden robes came forward and began chanting in the musical Zephyrian language. Other priests joined in and the sound filled the chamber. Jake felt the vibrations in his chest as their voices rose and fell in complex patterns. The chanting seemed to go on forever. When the chanting stopped, the head priest picked up a bronze sword and held it out to Jake. The sword was short and heavy with a leather grip that was worn smooth from many hands. Jake took it and felt the weight. It was not well balanced, but it was better than nothing. Next, they gave him a wooden shield with bronze reinforcements around the edges. The shield was scratched and dented from previous use. Jake could see dark stains on the wood that might have been blood. A leather strap let him carry it on his left arm. The priests brought out pots of the same red paint they had used before and began adding new symbols to Jake's face and arms. The paint felt warm and sticky against his skin. As they painted, Jake noticed that some symbols were different from the ones Lisa had. These seemed more elaborate and had extra lines and curves. When the painting was finished, they led Jake outside for the first time since his capture. The Zephyrian city was built in a circle around the edge of an enormous pit. The pit was so wide Jake could barely see the other side. The walls were smooth black stone that looked like glass. They went straight down as far as Jake could see. Thousands of Zephyrians had gathered around the rim of the pit. They sat on stone benches that were carved right into the rock. Many held torches that flickered in the wind. The flames made dancing shadows on their blue faces. Jake could hear excited voices and the sound of drums that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The head priest raised his staff and the crowd fell silent. He began speaking in a loud voice that carried across the whole area. Jake could not understand the words, but he could tell it was some kind of ceremony. The priest pointed at Jake and then at the pit. The crowd made sounds that might have been approval or hunger. At the edge of the pit was a wooden platform with ropes and pulleys. The ropes were thick and looked strong enough to hold a person. Jake realized this was how they lowered the sacrifices. Down into the darkness. His mouth went dry as he looked at the simple but effective system. 4 guards pushed Jake onto the platform and began tying ropes around his waist and chest. The ropes were rough and scratched his skin through the cloth. They made sure the knots were tight, but not tight enough to cut off his breathing. Jake noticed they had done this many times before. The priest spoke again and gestured toward the pit. Jake looked down and saw nothing but black darkness. The walls were so smooth, they looked like they had been polished. There were no handholds or ledges that he could see. If he went down, there would be no way to climb back up. Jake felt his heart beating fast as the guards checked the ropes one more time. The crowd was getting excited and some were standing up to get a better view. The drums were beating faster now and Jake could feel the rhythm in his bones. The priest gave a signal and the guards began turning the pulleys. The platform tilted and Jake felt himself being lowered into the pit. The walls rose up around him. As he went down, the sounds of the crowd grew fainter and the light from their torches became dim. Spots far above. As Jake descended, he tried to study the walls for any features he could use. The stone was smooth but not perfectly flat. There were small cracks and variations in the surface. Near the bottom, he could see the walls changing color from black to dark red. The air was getting warmer and he could smell something like sulfur. The descent seemed to take forever, but finally Jake felt solid ground under his feet. The guards above loosened the ropes and Jake stepped off the platform. He was at the bottom of the pit and the walls stretched up into darkness above him. The only light came from a faint red glow deeper in the cave system. Jake untied the ropes and let them drop. He heard the pulleys turning as the guards pulled the platform back up. Now he was alone in the dragon's domain with only a dull bronze sword and a battered shield. Somewhere in the darkness ahead something large was moving, and Jake could hear the sound of breathing that was not his own. Jake stood at the bottom of the pit and let his eyes adjust to the dim red light. The air was hot and thick with the smell of sulfur and something else that reminded him of burned metal. He could hear the breathing getting closer and it sounded like a huge bellows working slowly. Each breath made a low rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep in the earth. The floor beneath his feet was rough stone covered with a layer of ash and small bones. Jake tried not to think about what the bones came from. He gripped his bronze sword tighter and raised his wooden shield. The weapon felt clumsy in his hand, but it was all he had. The red light was coming from somewhere deeper in the cave system. Jake could see openings in the walls that led to other tunnels. Some of the openings glowed brighter than others. The breathing sound was coming from the largest tunnel straight ahead. Jake knew that was where he would find the dragon. He moved forward slowly and tried to be as quiet as possible. His leather sandals made soft sounds on the stone floor. Behind him he could hear the faint voices of the Zephyrians far above. They were probably placing bets on how long he would last. The tunnel ahead curved to the left and opened into a large chamber. The walls were covered with crystals that gave off the red light. In the center of the chamber was a pool of bubbling lava that cast moving shadows everywhere. The heat hit Jake like a wall and sweat began running down his face. That was when he saw the dragon. Paraxis was lying beside the lava pool with his massive head resting on his front legs. The dragon was bigger than Jake had imagined. From nose to tail he was easily 60 feet long. His scales were black like the pit walls, but they had a shine that reflected the red light. His eyes were closed, but Jake could see they were the size of dinner plates. The dragon's breathing was slow and steady. Each time he exhaled, a small puff of glowing gas came from his nostrils. Jake could feel the heat from across the chamber. The dragon's wings were folded against his body, but Jake could see they were huge. When spread, they would probably fill the entire chamber. Jake stood perfectly still and tried to think. The dragon had not noticed him yet. This might be his only chance to get a good look at his opponent. He studied the creature's body, looking for weak spots. The scales looked thick and hard like armor. The neck was long and powerful. The legs were like tree trunks with claws that could tear through stone. The dragon's head was the most frightening part. Even at rest, it looked dangerous. The mouth was full of teeth that were longer than Jake's hand. The jaw muscles were thick and powerful. Jake could see scars on the dragon's face from old battles. This creature had been fighting and winning for a very long time. Suddenly, one of the dragon's eyes opened. It was bright orange like molten metal and focused directly on Jake. The breathing stopped and the chamber became silent except for the bubbling of the lava. Jake felt like a mouse being watched by a cat. The dragon lifted his head slowly and looked at Jake with both eyes. The creature seemed curious rather than angry. Jake got the feeling that Paraxis was used to having visitors, but they usually did not last long enough to be interesting. The dragon spoke in a voice like rolling thunder. The words were in the Zephyrian language, but Jake could understand the tone. It sounded like the dragon was asking a question. When Jake did not answer, the dragon tilted his head like a confused dog. Paraxis stood up slowly, and Jake saw just how big the creature really was. Standing on 4 legs, the dragon's back was level with Jake's head. The neck stretched up so the head was 20 feet above the ground. The tail was as long as the body and ended in a cluster of sharp spikes. The dragon walked around Jake in a slow circle. His movements were graceful despite his size. Each step made the ground shake slightly. Jake turned to keep facing the creature but did not make any aggressive moves. He was trying to learn as much as possible before the real fight began. The dragon stopped circling and sat back on his haunches like a giant cat. He looked down at Jake and made a sound that might have been laughter. The creature was clearly not impressed by what he saw. Jake was just another small sacrifice that would be over quickly. That was when Jake decided to act. He had learned 2 important things. First, the dragon was overconfident and not taking him seriously. Second, the creature was intelligent and curious. Both of those facts might be useful. Jake threw his shield at the dragon's face as hard as he could. The wooden shield bounced off the scales without doing any damage, but it got the dragon's attention. Paraxis roared and the sound filled the chamber like thunder. The orange eyes blazed with anger. The dragon's mouth opened and Jake saw a bright glow building in the creature's throat. This was the plasma breath that Lisa had warned him about. Jake dove to the side just as a stream of superheated gas shot from the dragon's mouth. The plasma hit the wall where Jake had been standing and melted the stone like butter. Jake rolled behind a large rock as the dragon turned to follow him. The plasma breath continued for several seconds before stopping. Jake could hear the dragon breathing hard. The attack had used up a lot of energy and the creature needed time to recover. Jake used the break to move to a different position. He had noticed that the chamber was full of volcanic vents that released steam and hot gas. If he could use those vents correctly, they might help him survive. The dragon tried to plasma breath again, but only a small puff of glowing gas came out. Jake smiled grimly. The creature needed time to recharge between attacks. That was his first real advantage. Jake jumped out from behind the rock and ran toward the dragon. Paraxis was surprised by the bold move and reared back. Jake slashed at the creature's front leg with his bronze sword. The blade barely scratched the scales, but it drew a thin line of dark blood. The dragon roared again and swung his massive head down toward Jake. Jake rolled away and felt the wind from the creature's jaws. He came up running and headed for the nearest tunnel. The dragon followed with heavy steps that shook the ground. Jake had survived the first encounter and even managed to wound the beast. Now the real battle would begin. Jake ran through the tunnel as fast as he could while the dragon's roars echoed behind him. The tunnel was narrow enough that Paraxis could not follow at full speed. The creature's massive body scraped against the walls as he pushed through. Jake could hear stone cracking and falling as the dragon forced his way forward. The tunnel split into 3 different paths ahead. Jake chose the middle one because it seemed to slope downward. He hoped it would lead to more open spaces where he could move around better. The dragon would have to guess which way he had gone, and that might buy him some time. Jake's plan worked. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter as he moved deeper into the cave system. The tunnel opened into another chamber that was smaller than the first one. This room had no lava pools, but the walls were covered with strange crystals that glowed with blue light instead of red. The air was cooler here and easier to breathe. In the center of the chamber, Jake found something that made him stop and stare. There was a pile of weapons and armor that looked much better than the bronze sword he carried. Some of the metal was black and shiny, while other pieces were silver-colored. These were not the simple weapons the Zephyrians had given him. Jake moved closer and examined the pile. There were swords with sharp edges that had not been dulled by time. There were spears with straight shafts and pointed tips. There were shields made of metal instead of wood. Some of the armor pieces looked like they would actually fit a human body. As Jake picked up a black metal sword, he realized what he was looking at. These were weapons from previous sacrifices who had been warriors instead of ordinary people. The Zephyrians had been feeding fighters to their dragon for many years. Some of those fighters had been good enough to bring real weapons with them. Jake quickly traded his bronze sword for the black metal one. The new weapon was perfectly balanced and felt right in his hands. The blade was sharp enough to cut through leather with a light touch. He also found a metal shield that was much stronger than the wooden one he had lost. While he was looking through the weapons, Jake found something else that caught his attention. There were pieces of armor that had strange symbols carved into them. The symbols were not Zephyrian, but they looked familiar. Jake realized they were from different alien races he had seen in his travels with the colonial fleet. This meant the dragon had been fed warriors from many different worlds. The Zephyrians were not just sacrificing their own people, but captives from other planets as well. Jake felt anger building inside him as he thought about all the lives that had been lost to feed this monster. Jake was examining a helmet when he heard the dragon's roar much closer than before. Paraxis had found his trail and was coming through the tunnels. Jake grabbed a few more weapons and headed for the far side of the chamber. There was another tunnel that led even deeper into the cave system. This tunnel was different from the others. The walls were covered with carvings that showed the history of the dragon and the Zephyrians. Jake could see pictures of the first time the aliens had encountered Paraxis. The dragon had been smaller then, and the Zephyrians had been afraid of him. As Jake moved through the tunnel, he saw more carvings that told the story. The Zephyrians had started feeding the dragon to keep him from attacking their city. Over the years, the dragon had grown bigger and stronger. The sacrifices had become a regular part of their culture. The tunnel opened into the largest chamber Jake had seen yet. This one was filled with ancient Zephyrian artifacts. There were statues and altars covered with the same symbols Jake had seen on the walls. In the center was a massive stone table that was stained dark with what looked like dried blood. Jake realized this was where the Zephyrians had performed their sacrifices in the early days. Before they had built the pit above, they had brought their victims down here to be killed on the altar. The dragon had probably eaten the bodies right here in this chamber. Jake was studying the altar when he noticed something important. There were grooves carved into the stone that led from the altar to different parts of the chamber. The grooves were filled with a black substance that looked like hardened lava. Jake traced one of the grooves with his finger and realized it led to a hole in the wall. The hole was connected to the volcanic system that heated the caves. Jake could feel warm air coming from the opening. His engineering training told him that this was part of a system the ancient Zephyrians had built to control the lava flows. If he could figure out how it worked, he might be able to use it against the dragon. Jake heard the sound of claws on stone and knew Paraxis was getting closer. He moved to the other side of the chamber and found more holes in the walls. These were connected to different parts of the volcanic system. Some had warm air coming from them while others seemed to go deeper into the earth. The dragon's roar echoed through the chamber as Paraxis entered through the tunnel Jake had used. The creature's orange eyes scanned the room and fixed on Jake. The dragon looked even more angry than before. The small wound on his leg had stopped bleeding, but it was still visible. Jake held up his new sword and shield. The black metal gleamed in the light from the crystals. Paraxis tilted his head and looked at the weapons with what might have been respect. The dragon had seen these weapons before when he had killed their previous owners. The dragon spoke again in the Zephyrian language. This time the tone was different. It sounded less like curiosity and more like a challenge. Jake got the feeling that Paraxis was acknowledging him as a real opponent instead of just another easy meal. Jake pointed his sword at the dragon and spoke in English. "Come on then," he said. "Let's finish this." The dragon seemed to understand the meaning even if he did not know the words. Paraxis lowered his head and prepared to charge. His claws dug into the stone floor as he gathered his strength. The real battle was about to begin, and both fighters knew that only one of them would leave this chamber alive. Jake gripped his weapons tighter and prepared to fight for his life. Paraxis charged across the chamber like a mountain made of muscle and rage. His massive claws tore chunks from the stone floor as he ran. Jake waited until the last second, then rolled to the side. The dragon's momentum carried him past, and he crashed into the far wall with a sound like thunder. Jake came up running and slashed at the dragon's side with his black metal sword. The blade bit deep into the scales and drew a line of dark blood. Paraxis roared and spun around faster than Jake thought possible for something so large. The dragon's tail whipped toward Jake's head. Jake ducked and felt the spikes on the tail's tip pass inches above his hair. He rolled forward and came up between the dragon's front legs. From this position he could see the softer scales on the creature's throat that Lisa had told him about. But they were covered by layers of hardened rock that had grown over the scales like natural armor. The dragon reared back on his hind legs and tried to crush Jake with his front claws. Jake dove backward and the claws hit the stone floor hard enough to crack it. While the dragon was off balance, Jake ran toward the ancient altar in the center of the chamber. Paraxis breathed his plasma attack, but Jake was already moving. The superheated gas melted the stone where he had been standing. Jake reached the altar and climbed on top of it. From here he could see the whole chamber, including the holes in the walls that connected to the volcanic system. The dragon charged again, but Jake was ready. He jumped off the altar just as Paraxis hit it with his full weight. The ancient stone cracked and split, but it did not break completely. The dragon shook his head and looked dazed from the impact. Jake ran to the nearest hole in the wall and looked inside. He could see that it was connected to a system of channels that carried lava through the mountain. His engineering training told him that the ancient Zephyrians had built this to control the flow of molten rock. If he could figure out how to operate it, he might be able to turn the dragon's own lair against him. Paraxis recovered from hitting the altar and turned toward Jake. The dragon's orange eyes blazed with fury. He had been fighting for centuries, and no sacrifice had ever lasted this long. The creature was getting tired, and that made him even more dangerous. Jake found what he was looking for near the base of the wall. There was a series of stone levers that were connected to the volcanic system. The levers were carved with Zephyrian symbols that probably explained how they worked. Jake could not read the symbols, but he could see that some levers were in different positions than others. The dragon charged again, and Jake pulled the first lever. Nothing happened at first, but then Jake heard a rumbling sound from deep in the earth. One of the holes in the wall began glowing brighter and hot air started flowing out faster. Jake had activated part of the system, but he needed to do more. Jake rolled away from the dragon's claws and pulled the second lever. This time the rumbling was louder, and Jake could feel the floor vibrating under his feet. Lava began flowing from one of the holes and pooled on the chamber floor. The heat increased and sweat poured down Jake's face. Paraxis seemed to realize what Jake was doing. The dragon moved to block his access to the other levers. The creature's head weaved back and forth as he tried to keep Jake away from the controls. But Jake was smaller and faster, and he managed to reach the third lever. When Jake pulled the third lever, the whole chamber shook. Lava began flowing from multiple holes, and the floor started to flood with molten rock. The dragon roared and breathed plasma at Jake, but the heat from the lava made the air shimmer, and the attack went wide. Jake ran along the edge of the chamber where the floor was still solid. He needed to get to the final lever, but the dragon was between him and it. The lava was spreading quickly, and soon there would be nowhere left to stand. The dragon tried to follow Jake, but his massive weight made the heated stone crack under his feet. Paraxis had to move carefully or risk falling into the lava. This gave Jake the chance he needed to reach the last lever. Jake grabbed the final lever and pulled it with all his strength. The rumbling became a roar that filled the chamber. Lava began shooting from the holes in the walls like fountains. The ancient volcanic system was fully active now, and the chamber was becoming a lake of fire. Paraxis was trapped in the center of the chamber, surrounded by lava. The dragon's scales could resist the heat, but the molten rock was too deep to walk through. The creature was effectively stuck while Jake remained on a narrow ledge near the wall, but Jake's victory was short-lived. The dragon spread his massive wings and launched himself into the air. Paraxis could fly, and the lava could not touch him while he was airborne. The creature's wings beat with powerful strokes that sent waves of hot air through the chamber. Jake realized his mistake too late. He had trapped the dragon, but he had also trapped himself. The lava was rising, and his ledge was getting smaller. In a few minutes he would have nowhere left to stand. The dragon hovered above the lava and looked down at Jake with what might have been satisfaction. Paraxis had been outmaneuvered, but his ability to fly gave him the final advantage. The creature could wait for the lava to force Jake into the open. Jake looked around desperately for another option. The chamber was filling with lava, and there was no way out except through the tunnel he had entered. But that tunnel was on the other side of the chamber, and the dragon was blocking his path. That was when Jake saw his chance. The dragon's position in the air put him directly under one of the lava fountains. If Jake could time it right, he might be able to bring the creature down. It was a desperate plan, but it was better than waiting to die. Jake picked up a spear from the weapons pile and took careful aim. He had one shot at this, and if he missed, the dragon would kill him. Jake threw the spear with all his strength at the base of the dragon's left wing. The spear flew through the superheated air and struck the dragon's left wing at the joint where it connected to his body. Paraxis roared in pain and surprise as the metal point pierced through the tough membrane. The wing folded, and the dragon began falling toward the lava below. But Paraxis was not finished yet. Even wounded, the dragon was a master of survival. As he fell, he twisted his massive body and used his remaining good wing to control his descent. Instead of crashing into the molten rock, he managed to land on the partially submerged altar in the center of the chamber. The ancient stone altar was the only solid ground left above the lava level. It was barely large enough for the dragon's body, and the heat from the surrounding molten rock was intense. Steam rose from the dragon's scales as they absorbed the thermal energy. Jake watched from his shrinking ledge as Paraxis struggled to maintain his balance on the altar. The dragon's wounded wing was useless, and dark blood dripped from the injury. The creature's orange eyes were filled with pain and rage, but also something else that Jake had not seen before. For the first time, the mighty dragon looked afraid. The lava continued to rise, and Jake's ledge was almost gone. He had maybe 30 seconds before he would have to jump into the molten rock or find another way across the chamber. The dragon was wounded and trapped, but Jake was in no better position. Jake noticed that some of the lava fountains were shooting molten rock high enough to reach the ceiling. The ancient Zephyrian engineers had built this system to move lava through the mountain, and some of it was designed to flow upward. If Jake could reach one of those upward flowing streams, he might be able to ride it to a higher level. The problem was getting to the fountain without being killed by the dragon. Paraxis might be wounded, but he could still breathe plasma, and his claws were deadly. Jake would have to get very close to the creature to reach the fountain he had spotted near the altar. Jake made his decision and jumped from the ledge into the shallow lava at the edge of the chamber. His boots began smoking immediately, but the leather held for now. He ran through the molten rock as fast as he could while the heat burned his legs through his clothes. Paraxis saw Jake coming and reared back to strike with his plasma breath. But the dragon's position on the altar was unstable, and he could not get a good angle for the attack. The superheated gas shot over Jake's head and hit the wall behind him. Jake reached the altar and climbed up. Beside the dragon, this close, he could see the layers of hardened rock that protected the creature's throat. But he could also see that the rock had cracks where the intense heat had made it expand. The volcanic system was doing what Jake's sword could not. The dragon tried to bite Jake, but his position on the narrow altar made it difficult to turn his massive head. Jake ducked under the snapping jaws and struck at the cracked rock on the dragon's throat with his sword. The black metal blade chipped away pieces of the hardened coating. Paraxis thrashed wildly and tried to knock Jake off the altar with his good wing. Jake held on and kept striking at the throat armor. More pieces broke away and he could see the softer scales underneath. The dragon's movements were getting weaker as blood loss and heat exhaustion took their toll. Jake raised his sword for what he hoped would be the final strike. The dragon's orange eyes met his, and for a moment they stared at each other. Paraxis was an ancient creature who had ruled this domain for centuries. But now his time was ending at the hands of a human who refused to give up. Jake drove his sword deep into the exposed scales on the dragon's throat. The blade pierced through the softer tissue and found something vital inside. Paraxis made a choking sound and dark blood poured from the wound. The dragon's eyes began to lose their glow. The mighty creature swayed on the altar and then toppled sideways into the lava. The molten rock hissed and steamed as it closed over the dragon's body. Paraxis was dead, and his centuries of terror were finally over. Jake quickly grabbed the upward-flowing lava fountain and let it carry him toward the ceiling. The molten rock burned his hands, but he held on until he reached a tunnel opening 20 feet above the chamber floor. He pulled himself into the tunnel just as his boots finally gave up and fell apart. Jake crawled through the tunnel on his hands and knees until he found a chamber with cooler air. His clothes were burned and his skin was red from the heat, but he was alive. More importantly, he had done something that no one thought was possible. He had killed the dragon, but Jake was not safe yet. He needed to find a way out of the cave system and back to the surface. The tunnel he was in led upward, and he could feel a slight breeze that suggested it connected to the outside world. Jake began climbing. It took hours, but finally Jake saw light ahead that was not the red glow of lava. Real sunlight was coming. Through an opening in the rock, Jake climbed faster and emerged onto a ledge on the side of the mountain. Far below he could see the Zephyrian city built around the pit. Jake looked at his reflection in a pool of water near the cave entrance. He was burned and bloody and his clothes were in tatters. But he was holding something that would prove his victory. Before leaving the dragon's chamber, he had used his sword to cut off one of Paraxis's horns. The horn was black and twisted, and everyone would recognize it. Jake began the long climb down the mountain toward the city. When the Zephyrians saw him coming, they could not believe their eyes. No sacrifice had ever returned from the pit. The guards ran to get the high priest while crowds gathered to stare at the impossible sight. Jake walked through the city gates carrying the dragon's horn. The high priest appeared with his golden robes and tall hat. His forearms trembled as he recognized what Jake was holding. In the Zephyrian language he spoke words that Jake did not need. Translated, the dragon god was dead and everything had changed. Jake used his victory to negotiate for Lisa's freedom and the release of all other prisoners. He also arranged for peaceful contact between the Zephyrians and Earth's colonial fleet. When the rescue ships arrived a week later, they found Jake had become something of a legend among the alien people. Some Zephyrians wanted to worship Jake as a new god, but he refused. Instead, he helped them understand that there were better ways to live than feeding people to monsters. The age of sacrifice was over and a new age of cooperation was beginning. Jake Morrison had gone into the pit as a prisoner, but emerged as the man who changed an entire civilization.